Anne of Cleves is a singular figure in the turbulent marital history of Henry VIII. Born into German nobility, this lady briefly became Queen Consort of England in 1540, although her reign lasted only 6 months. Her fate, however, was unusual. After the marriage was annulled, Anne kept her head, preserving her fortune and dignity amidst the bloody record of the Tudor monarch's repudiated or executed wives. Of Protestant origin and modest education, Anne arrived at the English court as part of a political alliance, only to encounter a cultural and personal clash with the king. In this documentary, we will follow Anne of Cleves' life chronologically, from her birth in the German Duchy of Cleves to her death in England. Before we dive in, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Without further delay, let's begin. Childhood in the Duchy of Cleves. Anne was born in 1515 in Düsseldorf, capital of the Duchy of Cleves, part of the Holy Roman Empire. Daughter of Duke John III of Cleves and Mary of Jülichburg, she grew up in a court with Protestant leanings, opposed to the Catholic hegemony of Charles V. Her upbringing was overseen by her mother, who prepared her to be a competent German noblewoman. Unlike English ladies of the time, educated in music and dance, Anne received a practical and pious education. She learned to read and write in German and stood out in domestic tasks such as sewing, cooking, and household management. She was not taught to play instruments or to dance, skills considered frivolous in her environment, but highly valued at the lavish Tudor court. This sober education reflected the austere character of her homeland, governed under the influence of the Protestant Reformation. At the age of 11, Anne was betrothed to Francis, son of the Duke of Lorraine, as part of European dynastic alliances, although that arrangement was eventually cancelled when both reached marriageable age. Thus, by the end of the 1530s, Anne remained single, a princess available in the volatile matrimonial market of Renaissance Europe. A marriage for political alliance. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VIII was once again widowed and in search of a wife. In 1537, the king's third consort, Jane Seymour, had died after finally giving him a male heir, Prince Edward. Obsessed with securing the succession and obtaining one more son for the Tudor dynasty, Henry decided to marry for a 4th time. But this time, the choice would have a strong political component. England, separated from the Church of Rome since 1534, was isolated and threatened by the Catholic powers of France and the Empire of Charles V. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw in the reformist German provinces a natural ally for England. He thus set his sights on Anne of Cleves, whose family, now led by her brother Duke William, headed a bloc of Protestant states defying Catholic imperial power. A union with Anne offered Henry a strategic alliance with the Lutheran princes of Germany, strengthening England's position on the European board. Cromwell negotiated the marriage diligently. To ensure the bride's appearance, Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to paint Anne and also her sister Amalia. The king's instruction was clear: the portrait must be true to reality, without flattery or embellishments. Holbein complied and produced a portrait of Anne with a serene face, dressed in rich garments in the style of Cleves. Upon seeing the image, Henry declared himself satisfied. Anne appeared attractive and suitable for the position. Convinced by Holbein's brush and the favorable reports of his ambassadors, the king gave the green light to the marriage agreement. In October 1539, the marriage treaty between England and Cleves was signed. At that time, Anne was 24 years old and Henry was 48, with a notable age difference and, as would soon become evident, of temperament as well. Arrival in England and the disastrous first impression. Anne set off on the long journey to her new kingdom in the autumn of 1539. After a winter crossing, she landed in Dover at the end of December. By Henry's order, meetings were organized along the way to welcome her. But the king, impatient and curious, decided to orchestrate a romantic surprise inspired by chivalric novels. On the 1st of January 1540, Henry rode to Rochester, where Anne was resting before her official entry into London. Wearing a cloak and mask, he entered his betrothed's chambers in disguise, eager to recreate the courtly ritual of love at first sight. The scene, however, was far from a fairy tale. Anne, untrained in such courtly games, did not recognize the king under the disguise and reacted with confusion. According to witnesses, Henry approached and greeted her effusively, even attempted to kiss her. But the German princess was startled and pushed him away, upset by the lack of ceremony and demanding to know who the bold man was. This was a blow to the monarch's pride, accustomed to flattery and the norms of French gallantry. Frustrated and wounded in his vanity, Henry abruptly left the meeting, muttering in disdain the now famous phrase, "I like her not." That fateful first impression doomed the king's mood towards Anne, even before reaching the altar. In the days that followed, Henry tried to stop what he already considered a misstep. He protested privately that Anne was not as fair as had been proclaimed, and lamented before his courtiers that, if it weren't for the advanced state of negotiations and the risk of offending the Duchy of Cleves, he would not proceed with the marriage. He even blamed Holbein for having deceived him with an overly flattering portrait, and his advisors, especially Cromwell, for exaggerating Anne's charms. In a scornful tone, Henry was said to have compared the young woman to a Flemish draft animal. "I have brought over a great Flanders mare," he reportedly said, crudely referring to his new betrothed. It is ironic that the king, then obese, with a waist over 130 centimeters and suffering from leg ulcers, should complain about Anne's appearance. Despite his reluctance, Henry VIII found himself trapped by reasons of state. Breaking the engagement at that stage could alienate the Germans and damage his prestige. Resigned and still hoping for the best, the king formally met Anne at Greenwich in the first days of 1540, no longer in disguise, and proceeded with the wedding preparations. A brief marriage and a convenient annulment. Anne of Cleves married Henry VIII on the 6th of January 1540 at Greenwich Palace in a lavish ceremony befitting Tudor royalty. The new queen consort, dressed in rich brocades and jewels, wore on her wedding ring a hopeful inscription, "God send me well to keep." However, behind the public pomp, the couple's private life was a foretold disaster. Henry, displeased since their first meeting, showed coldness towards Anne. The wedding night confirmed his worst fears. The next morning, the king angrily confessed to Thomas Cromwell that he had not consummated the marriage. "I liked her little before, but now I like her much less," snapped Henry, admitting he had been unable to fulfill his conjugal duties. According to Cromwell's own account, His Majesty declared he felt no desire for Anne, and that, if he tried to lie with her, his body would not respond. Henry even shared humiliating details, claiming that in his view, Anne's body was flabby and that she smelled unpleasant, comments more revealing of the monarch's wounded pride than of Anne's actual appearance. The young queen, for her part, seemed bewildered by the rejection. Raised to obey, she may not have fully understood what Henry expected of her. She did not speak English and was unfamiliar with many court customs which hindered any intimacy. Nevertheless, Anne remained publicly silent on the matter. Privately, her ladies and attendants noticed her distress. Karl Haast, the envoy from Cleves, reported that Anne appeared frightened by her position and took the matter with great heaviness, perhaps fearing she might suffer the fate of previous repudiated wives, and she had reason to worry. She knew that Catherine of Aragon had died in exile after her divorce, and that Anne Boleyn had been executed after losing royal favor, but Anne's attitude towards Henry himself was one of cautious submission. Wisely, she chose not to oppose the king's will. In the months that followed, Henry virtually avoided his new wife and began seeking a way to rid himself of this inconvenient marriage. His attention had already turned to a lady-in-waiting at court, the young and lively Catherine Howard, niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. Furthermore, the geopolitical situation that had once made the alliance with Cleves desirable had shifted. France and the Empire no longer seemed so united, reducing the urgency of a religious pact with the Germans. Determined to annul the marriage, Henry ordered Cromwell to find a legal solution as soon as possible. At the beginning of July 1540, just 6 months after the wedding, Anne was sent away from court under pretexts, while an ecclesiastical council prepared the verdict. On the 9th of July, A group of senior clergymen declared the marriage between Henry and Anne invalid, citing two reasons: the lack of consummation, a marriage not consummated could be annulled without issue, and the existence of a prior betrothal between Anne and the Duke of Lorraine, which technically nullified her consent to marry Henry. It is worth noting that Anne was not even called to testify in person during the process. She was informed of the decision once it had already been made. When the royal envoys announced the annulment, Anne of Cleves reacted, according to the official report, with surprising calm, showing no change in countenance. Inwardly, she may have felt humiliation and fear, but she showed remarkable astuteness. She offered no resistance. On the contrary, she promptly sent a letter to her brother, the Duke of Cleves, informing him that she accepted the king's decision and wished to remain in England as his sister and loyal subject. She even symbolically returned the wedding ring and asked for it to be broken, as a thing of no strength or value. This meek cooperation from Anne became her passport to safety. Henry, relieved to avoid an international scandal, praised her for her submissive attitude. Finally free from an unwanted marriage, the king would wed Catherine Howard as soon as the 28th of July, 1540, the very same day that Cromwell, scapegoat for the failed match, was executed in the Tower of London. Cromwell's fall was a brutal reminder of royal caprice. While one of the most powerful men in the kingdom lost his head for having arranged the unfortunate union, Anne of Cleves, the rejected one, emerged as a survivor. King's sister, life after the divorce. Anne might have found herself in a precarious position after the annulment, banished or imprisoned, as had happened to others, but she managed to turn a marital defeat into a personal triumph. Henry VIII, grateful for Anne's obedience and eager to maintain good relations with the Duchy of Cleves, granted her a generous settlement. He officially named her King's sister, giving her precedence at court just below the Queen and the King's daughters. She also received a fortune, an annual pension of £500, and several noble estates including Richmond Palace, a former royal residence, and Hever Castle, which had once belonged to the Boleyn family. Overnight, Anne became one of the richest and most independent women in England. With her own household, staff at her service, and the respect due to a princess, she enjoyed privileges denied to many women of her time. Far from lamenting, Madame of Cleves, as she was now called, seemed to adapt to her new life with relief. The French ambassador Charles de Marillac observed in August 1540 that Anne appeared more cheerful than ever. She wears a great variety of gowns and spends her time in sports and pastimes. Freed from Henry's marital expectations, the former queen flourished. She learned to ride horses, to hunt, to enjoy banquets, and even to dance, an activity she had never practiced before. She even began to learn some English, breaking the language barrier that had isolated her at first. Henry, for his part, was cordial with her both in public and private. He would occasionally visit her at her properties, treating her in effect as an honorary sister. The mutual courtesy between them was, in a way, a happy and unusual ending for such a mismatched couple. Anne remained in England for the rest of her life. She never returned to live in Germany. At just 25 years old in 1540, she found herself with an unusual degree of personal freedom. She was young, wealthy, unmarried, and under the protection of the most powerful king in the region. Some rumors suggested that Anne, deep down, still held hopes of returning to the throne. Anne's own brother, Duke William of Cleves, even formally proposed that his sister marry the king again. But Henry showed little interest in resaddling the mare, as one might say caustically. Anne herself did not insist on becoming queen again. She enjoyed her peculiar status and perhaps understood that she had come out ahead in the end. Even so, Anne continued to be part of the extended royal family circle. In January 1541, Henry even invited her to spend the holidays at court, at Hampton Court Palace. There, Anne had to pay homage to the young new queen, Catherine Howard. Ironically, Catherine had served as Anne's lady-in-waiting during her brief reign. The chronicles say that both women danced together in the Great Hall while Henry looked on, pleased, perhaps enjoying the moment when his former and his brand new wife displayed good harmony. It was a political gesture of reconciliation. The king presented Anne as a loyal sister, and Catherine showed humility by treating the former queen with respect. That improbable scene of courtly coexistence highlighted the extraordinary nature of Anne of Cleves' situation. She had gone from being rejected to becoming an honorary royal relative, something without precedent in Tudor history. Relations with the royal daughters. Friendship with Mary Tudor. One of the most notable aspects of Anne of Cleves' later life was her relationship with the daughters of Henry VIII, particularly Princess Mary Tudor. When Anne arrived in England, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was about 23 years old, just 9 years younger than Anne herself, placing them in a similar generation. While nominally Anne became her stepmother for a brief period, in practice their relationship was more akin to that of two high-born ladies than that of mother and daughter. Despite their religious differences, Mary was a devout Catholic and Anne came from a Protestant background. It was said that they got along surprisingly well, bonding through personality. It is possible that Mary appreciated the kindness Anne showed her during her brief time as queen, in contrast to the tensions she had endured with previous stepmothers. Moreover, Anne never attempted to usurp the place of Mary's mother or interfere with her rights, which undoubtedly made cordial relations easier. With Elizabeth, Henry's younger daughter by Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves also had some contact, though more limited, since Elizabeth was still a child during the years Anne frequented the court. Even so, Anne held sufficient affection for both princesses that, when she later wrote her will, she left them gifts and asked Mary and Elizabeth to look after some of her servants after her death. This detail demonstrates the sincere closeness she developed with Henry's daughters. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Anne remained in England under the reign of the young Edward VI. During this period, she largely withdrew from public life, residing quietly on her estates. Her financial situation was somewhat affected by political shifts. The reformist government of Edward reduced some of her incomes, but she never completely lost favor. Upon Edward's death in 1553, Mary Tudor ascended the throne as Mary I of England. With the former princess now queen, Anne of Cleves regained ceremonial prominence. Despite her Protestant past, she did not hesitate to adapt to the new times. She attended Mary's triumphant entry into London and accompanied the new sovereign during her coronation procession, standing with dignity beside Princess Elizabeth in a place of honor. As a sign of loyalty and personal diplomacy, Anne even publicly embraced Catholicism, attending Mass according to the Roman Rite, in order to remain on the right side of the devout queen. Mary I, for her part, initially showed Anne great respect. She lavished her with attention, granting her honors at court. Anne responded by sending congratulations on key occasions. For example, she wrote to express joy when Mary announced her marriage to Philip II of Spain in 1554. However, with time, dark clouds appeared over this friendship. Mary's unpopular marriage to Philip and the Protestant rebellion of Thomas Wyatt in 1554 placed many reformist-leaning courtiers under suspicion. Unfortunately, malicious rumors suggested that Anne of Cleves, due to her closeness with Princess Elizabeth, Mary's Protestant half-sister, and her connections to German nobles, might have held sympathies for the rebel cause. Although no evidence was ever presented against Anne, and she was never formally accused of treason, it seems that Mary I began to keep her at a distance following the insurrection. In the final years of Mary's reign, Anne was no longer frequently invited to court and chose a more secluded life in the countryside, far from courtly intrigues. Even so, there was no open enmity between the two women, who officially maintained cordial relations. Death and legacy. Anne of Cleves outlived Henry VIII and most of the king's other wives. After nearly 2 decades living in England as a distinguished and independent lady, Anne fell ill during the years 1556 and 1557. She passed away peacefully on 16th of July 1557 at her residence in Chelsea, aged 41. In a final gesture of respect, Queen Mary I ordered that Anne be buried with near royal honors. Her funeral, conducted according to the Catholic rite, was held with great pomp at Westminster Abbey. There, near the high altar, lie her remains, making Anne of Cleves the only wife of Henry VIII to be buried in the traditional resting place of English monarchs. Mary, despite any past reservations, showed through this tribute that Anne still held a special place in her affection until the very end. History has come to smile upon Anne of Cleves. For centuries, she was ridiculed by chroniclers and ambassadors as the ugly wife of Henry VIII, unfairly labelled in popular memory as the Flanders mare. Yet, in a twist of fate, what once seemed misfortune turned into blessing. By humbly accepting the annulment, Anne saved her life and prospered. Ironically, she was the only one of Henry VIII's 6 wives who truly came out victorious. She not only kept her head on her shoulders, literally, but lived in comfort, with title, wealth, and the freedom to be herself. Her own era recognized her virtues. Holinshed's chronicles praised her as a lady of right, commendable regard, courteous, gentle, a good housekeeper, and very bountiful to her servants. In other words, Anne of Cleves earned dignity and respect where others lost everything. In retrospect, Anne was the clever survivor. Her life beyond those 6 months of marital misfortune is that of a woman who knew how to adapt and find her place in a world ruled by the volatility of a tyrant. Henry VIII may have once said with disdain, "I like her not," but history, in time, has come to like Anne of Cleves very much indeed. Thank you for joining us until the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have anything to add, feel free to share it with us in the comments section. Give us a like and share the link with all your friends and family so they too can learn more about the life of Queen Anne of Cleves, 4th wife of King Henry VIII. Thank you for following us, and if you haven't subscribed yet, we invite you to do so and turn on the notification bell, as we regularly upload historical content you'll surely find fascinating. See you in the next video.